Part 1: Harms. In an elementary classroom, imagine a student named Maya who hesitates as she is asked to read aloud. She stumbles over words, falls behind her peers, and begins to dread being called on. Over time, she stops participating altogether. Her teacher interprets this withdrawal as disengagement rather than a possible learning disability, and no evaluation is initiated. In another classroom, imagine a student named Jordan who struggles to complete written assignments and becomes increasingly disruptive as the work becomes more difficult. Instead of being assessed for a learning disability, he is disciplined for behavioral issues. These cases illustrate a broader and often overlooked problem in the U.S. schools. Many students with learning disabilities are never identified and therefore never receive the support they need. These patterns are not only reflected in research, but also visible in classroom settings. In my own experience working in a special education classroom this year, I have observed how students who receive appropriate support are better able to engage with academic material and participate in class. In contrast, students who struggle without clear support often show signs of frustration, withdrawal, or behavioral challenges. These observations align with broader research showing that lack of identification and intervention can shape both academic and emotional outcomes over time. Under-identification of learning disabilities occurs when students who meet clinical or educational criteria for disabilities are not formally recognized or provided with appropriate services. While approximately 15% of public school students in the United States receive special education services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA, and about 32% of those students are classified as having specific learning disabilities. Research suggests that a larger proportion of students experience significant learning challenges that go unaddressed. Estimates indicate that millions of students may fall into this gap, particularly those who are never referred for evaluation or who fall just below eligibility thresholds. This paper argues that such under-identification produces a range of significant harms, including cumulative academic failure, emotional and psychological distress, behavioral consequences, and long-term limitations in educational and economic outcomes, all of which can shape students' developmental trajectories over time. Learning disabilities include conditions such as dyslexia, reading difficulties, dyscalculia, math difficulties, and dysgraphia, written expression difficulties, as well as other specific neurodevelopmental disorders that affect information processing and academic skill acquisition. These disabilities are neurologically based and affect how individuals process and retain information, rather than reflecting intelligence. When identified early, students can receive targeted interventions such as structured literacy instruction, individualized learning plans, and classroom accommodations. Without these supports, however, students must navigate academic environments that they are not designed for their learning needs, increasingly the likelihood of sustained difficulty. One of the most immediate and measurable harms of under-identification is persistent academic difficulty. Early academic skills, especially in reading and mathematics, serve as a foundation for later learning. Odom and Woolry, drawing on a synthesis of evidence-based practices in early childhood special education, conclude that interventions are most effective when they are systematically individualized and implemented as soon as developmental delays are identified. Because their work reviews multiple intervention studies rather than relying on a single sample, it demonstrates a consistent pattern across contexts. Early support significantly improves outcomes. When students are not identified early, they miss the critical window, allowing foundational academic difficulties to compound over time. For example, a student with undiagnosed dyslexia may struggle to develop early reading skills, which then limits comprehension across all subjects that rely on reading. By middle school, these students may be several grade levels behind their peers. The academic consequences of under-identification are cumulative rather than isolated. Students who fall behind early often continue to fall further behind as new material builds on previous unmet skills. This can lead to lower grades, increased likelihood of grade retention, and decreased chances of graduating from high school. These patterns demonstrate that the harms of under-identification are not isolated, but interconnected, with early academic struggles reinforcing later educational disadvantages. Beyond academic performance, under-identification is associated with significant emotional and psychological harms. Students who consistently struggle without a clear explanation of often experience confusion, frustration, and anxiety. Without a diagnosis, There is no framework for understanding their difficulties, which can lead students to internalize their struggles as personal failure. Many begin to view themselves as less capable than their peers, even when their challenges stem from specific learning differences. Longitudinal research highlights that these early experiences can extend across their life course. West and Camus analyzed nationally representative longitudinal data tracking individuals from childhood into mid and late life, using repeated measures of depression symptoms to examine long-term outcomes. They find that childhood disability is associated with persistently higher depression symptoms across the life course. Because this study follows individuals over decades, it demonstrates how early challenges can accumulate into lasting psychological effects. For students whose learning disabilities are never formally identified or supported, these risks may be intensified by prolonged academic struggle and lack of understanding. The absence of recognition can deepen feelings of isolation, as many students believe they are alone in their difficulties. In classroom settings, these emotional responses often manifest behavioral patterns. Some students withdraw from participation, avoiding activities that expose their struggles, such as reading aloud or completing written assignments. Others may respond with frustration or disruptive behavior, particularly when repeated failure leads to embarrassment or stress. Research by Fish, based on an experimental design in which teachers were presented with identical student profiles that varied only by demographic characters, found that teachers' perceptions of recommended interventions differed systematically based on students' race and ethnicity. Although the study focuses on teacher response, it helps illustrate how students' behavior can be interpreted differently depending on context. When learning difficulties are not identified, behaviors such as disengagement or disruption may be misinterpreted, leading to disciplinary responses rather than academic support. This can further remove students from instructional time, reinforcing a cycle of academic difficulty and behavioral consequences. The harms of under-identification also extend beyond the classroom into long-term life outcomes. Educational attainment is closely linked to employment opportunities, income stability, and overall well-being. Students who do not receive appropriate support for learning disabilities may struggle to meet the academic requirements necessary for college admissions or vocational training. As a result, they may face limited career opportunities and reduced earning potential. Over time, these constraints can contribute to a broader pattern of economic instability. Although under-identification affects students across all backgrounds, its impacts are not evenly distributed. Morgan, Hugh, and O examined disparities in disability identification using large-scale, nationally representative data when controlling for academic performance and behavior. Their findings show that racial and ethnic disparities in disability identifications persist even after controlling for academic achievement and behavioral measures. This methodological approach strengthens the conclusion that differences in identification are not simply due to differences in need. Instead, students from marginalized backgrounds, particularly Black and Hispanic students, as well as those from low-income families, are less likely to be identified even when they demonstrate similar levels of difficulty as their peers. As a result, the harms associated with under-identification are more likely to affect students who are already navigating additional educational outcomes. Understanding these harms also requires situating them within the broader context of inequality. Students from low-income backgrounds and students of color often face additional barriers, including limited access to early childhood education, fewer academic support systems outside of school, and greater exposure to environmental stressors that can affect learning. When learning disabilities go unrecognized in these contexts, the consequences may be more severe. For example, a student who struggles with reading but lacks both school-based interventions and access to outside resources may experience more significant and lasting academic delays than a student with similar needs and a more resource-rich environment. Qualitative research further illustrates how these experiences are understood by students themselves. In a study of students with learning disabilities, participants described prolonged periods of confusion of self-doubt prior to diagnosis, often attributing their struggles to a lack of intelligence rather than a specific learning disability. One participant reflected that they believed they were just not as smart as their peers, despite putting in significant effort. These accounts highlight how the absence of identification shapes not only academic outcomes, but also student self-perceptions, often leading to internalized feelings of inadequacy. The cumulative nature of these harms is one of the most significant features. A lack of early identification can innate a chain reaction. Early academic struggles lead to frustration and disengagement, which contribute to lower achievement, which in turn limits future opportunities. This process unfolds gradually but can have lasting consequences across multiple domains of life, including education, mental health, and economic stability. In some, underidentification of learning disabilities in U.S. schools results in a complex set of interconnected harms. These include persistent academic difficulties, emotional and psychological distress, behavioral challenges, and long-term limitations in educational and economic outcomes. These harms are particularly pronounced among students from marginalized backgrounds who may already face additional barriers within the education system. By examining the range and depth of these impacts, it becomes clear that the absence of identification and support plays a significant role in the shaping students' developmental trajectories. Part 2. Structures. Drawing on Jonathan Eastwood's framework of social structures as durable, individual spanning configurations of rules, relationships, and representations, I argue that the underidentification and unequal inclusion of students with disabilities emerge from two interlocking structural mechanisms. One, institutional rules governing funding and enforcement under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, and two, racialized representational frameworks that shape how student ability and behavior are interpreted. Together, these structures systematically constrain identification processes and reproduce inequality across schools. Eastwood emphasizes that rules define what actions are possible within institutions. In special education, IDEA establishes a formal guarantee of individualized support, but its implementation depends heavily on how it's funded and enforced. Although Congress originally committed to covering up to 40% of special education costs, federal contributions have historically fallen far short, averaging closer to 15 to 18%. Bonac and Hill, drawing on public health and educational data, argue that this chronic underfunding functions as a structural constraint on school capacity. Their analyses synthesize national datasets to argue that special education access operates as a social detriment of health. They estimate that millions of children who qualify for services do not receive them, including over 1 million with specific learning disabilities, that nearly 3 million with speech language impairments. However, because their findings rely on population level estimates rather than experimental methods, they demonstrate large-scale disparities without definitively isolating causal mechanisms. Funding inequalities across districts further compound these constraints. Longitudinal economic research using district-level data finds that school finance reforms have reduced some income-based funding gaps, but significant disparities persist, particularly along racial lines. These studies use quasi-experimental designs to evaluate policy changes over time, strengthening their causal claims about funding and outcomes. At the same time, some policy analysts caution that funding alone is not a sufficient solution. Research from the Brookings Institution argues that while increased funding can improve outcomes, it does not eliminate disparities in access or achievement. These scholars emphasize that how resources are allocated and the institutional practices governing their use are just as important as the total funding levels. This perspective complicates purely resource-based explanations by highlighting the role of decision-making processes within schools. Even if funding were equalized, disparities in identification would likely remain. Per-pupil funding averages can obscure how resources are distributed within schools, particularly when a small number of students require disproportionately high expenditures due to severe disabilities. Additionally, lower-income students may require more resources to achieve comparable outcomes due to cumulative disadvantage. These realities highlight a key limitation of funding reform. Equal inputs do not automatically produce equitable outcomes. IDEA's enforcement mechanisms further illustrate how structural rules interact with relationships. Although the law guarantees services, it relies heavily on private enforcement, meaning that families must advocate for evaluations and accommodations. Bonac and Hill also report that many families, particularly those from lower income backgrounds, lack awareness of their legal rights or the resources needed to advocate for them. Their conclusions draw from studies of medical legal partnerships and surveys of families navigating special education systems. For example, research shows that a sustainable portion of families and children who have significant academic or health-related needs have never requested an IEP, often due to lack of information rather than a lack of need. This enforcement structure creates inequality through relationships. Families with greater social, cultural, and economic capital are better positioned to navigate complex bureaucracies. Wealthier parents are more likely to hire advocates, request independent evaluations, and challenge school decisions, while under-resourced families may rely entirely on school-initiated referrals. At the same time, some scholars argue that decentralized enforcement allows for flexibility and individualized advocacy. However, in practice, the system places disproportionate burdens on those least equipped to meet them, reinforcing structural inequalities. Beyond formal rules, Eastwood identifies representations as shared interpretive frameworks that shape how individuals are understood. In education, these representations influence whether academic struggle is recognized as a disability. Educational systems often rely on standardized notion of average performance, as discussed in the school community, individuals, and environment. This emphasis on norm-based assessment can obscure individual variation and promote conformity-based benchmarks. When students deviate from expected standards, their behavior may be interpreted as a lack of effort rather than as evidence of cognitive difference. These interpretive challenges are produced through testing regimes, curriculum standards, and accountability systems that prioritize uniform outcomes. As a result, identification becomes cognate on how closely a student's struggles align with the recognized category rather than on their actual needs. Representational structures are also racialized. LNS uses logistical regression analysis on national data sets to examine how race, disability status, and adverse childhood experiences interact in shaping school discipline and exclusion. This finding indicates that students of color with mental disabilities face higher rates of expulsionary discipline, even when controlling for other variables. When regression analysis identifies statistical associations rather than definitive causation, the consistency of these patterns suggests systematic bias. LNS also finds that formal diagnoses can function as a protective factor. Students with documented disabilities are more likely to receive support services, while those without diagnoses, disproportionately students of color, are more likely to be disciplined. Koch provides further evidence using longitudinal data tracking students over time. Analyzing a nationally represented data set, Koch finds that approximately 66% of white students with disabilities are included in general education classrooms for most of the school day, compared to lower percentages of Black and Hispanic students. Even after controlling for disability type and school characteristics, these disabilities still persist. A key finding is that academic test scores are more strongly associated with placement decisions for Black students than for white students. This suggests that performance metrics are interpreted differently depending on race, reflecting structural bias embedded within institutional decision-making. Eastwood emphasizes that social structures are durable and persist across time. Koch's longitudinal finding supports this claim. Disparities in inclusion appear as early as first grade and remain relatively stable through high school. These educational patterns with broader definitions of social detriments of health. When students are not identified early, they miss access to interventions that could alter their academic trajectories. At the same time, it is important to avoid overstating causality. While early identification is associated with better outcomes, it is one of the many factors influencing long-term success alongside family environment and broader socio-economic conditions. The under-identification of learning disabilities and the unequal inclusion of students with disabilities are not isolated failures or random oversights. They are produced through durable social structures that shape how school operates. Funding rules constrain institutional capacity, enforcement mechanisms privilege families with greater resources, and racialized representations enforce how student behavior is interpreted. Simultaneously, addressing these disparities is not straightforward. Equalizing funding alone may be insufficient. Enforcement reforms must balance equity with flexibility, and changing representational frameworks require shifts in both policy and practice. Without confronting these structural foundations, disparity in identification and inclusion will continue to persist, even as service level reforms suggest progress. Part 3: Solutions. To address the under-identification of learning disabilities in U.S. public schools, policymakers should adopt a dual approach, restructuring and increasing targeted special education funding alongside implementing universal early screening systems. While increased funding alone is insufficient, combining financial reform with standardized identification processes is both more practically effective and morally justified, as it better secures students' core capabilities and reduces inequitable access to educational support. In this context, effectiveness must be understood as more than simply increasing the number of students identified with learning disabilities. A policy is effective if it improves the accuracy and timing of identification, reduces disparities across racial and socioeconomic groups, and leads to measurable improvements in student outcomes, including literacy development, grade progression, and long-term educational attainment. Taking together the evidence of early identification and intervention suggests that the effect of universal screening and expanded early support would be meaningful but incremental at the population level. In practical terms, gains of approximately 0.2 to 0.4 standard deviations in early literacy and math achievement are often associated with several months of additional academic progress, particularly in foundational reading skills during elementary school. Studies of early intervention and special education services consistently find improvements in academic outcomes when support is provided during early elementary years rather than after prolonged delay, with effects that are strongest in reading acquisition and basic numeracy development. Scaled across the school system, this would likely translate into a measurable reduction in the proportion of students performing below basic proficiency levels and an increase in the number of students reaching grade level expectations by the end of third and fourth grade. While these effects would not eliminate achievement gaps on their own, they would shift a significant number of students out of the lowest performing categories and reduce the likelihood of long-term academic tracking into remedial pathways. One central response to under-identification involves increasing and restructuring funding for special education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act IDEA. Although IDEA was originally intended to cover up to 40% of the additional costs associated with special education, federal contributions have consistently fallen far short of this goal. This persistent shortfall places disproportional strain on school districts, particularly those serving low-income communities, limiting their capacity to conduct timely evaluations and provide adequate support. Research demonstrates that both the amount and distribution of school funding significantly shapes educational outcomes. Jackson, Johnson, and Persico, using quasi-experimental methods that trace the effects of court-mandated school finance reforms over time, find that increases in pure pupil spending lead to higher educational attainment, increased adult earnings, and reduced poverty, particularly for students of low-income backgrounds. Similarly, Latude, Rosenstein, and Schwarzenbach analyzed distinct level longitudinal data and show that reforms directing more funding towards disadvantaged districts improve student achievement and reduce achievement gaps. These findings suggest that financial investment is not merely beneficial but foundational to improving long-term outcomes. However, funding alone is insufficient if allocation systems remain inequitable. Current funding structures rely heavily on local property taxes and outdated formulas, resulting in substantial disparities between districts. At the federal level, IDEA funding is distributed through a formula that produces differences across states that does not always align with levels of need. Research from the Brookings Institution further suggests that while school finance reforms have made funding more equal across income groups, they have not eliminated racial disparities and in some cases have allowed them to persist. These findings demonstrate that race-neutral funding reforms are insufficient to address deeply rooted structural inequalities. Accordingly, policymakers should both increase IDEA funding towards its intended level and revise its allocation formula to better reflect current patterns of need, including disability prevalence, poverty, and demographic disparities. Restructured funding system would expand schools' capacity to hire specialists, reduce evaluation delays, and provide more effective interventions, thereby improving both identification accuracy and student outcomes. A second, more immediate, actionable reform is the implementation of universal early screening systems for learning disabilities. Current identification processes rely heavily on teacher referrals and parent advocacy, both of which vary significantly across contexts and are sustainable to biases. These processes contribute to disparities in identification rates across racial and socioeconomic groups. Multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, are structured frameworks used in schools to provide varying levels of academic and behavioral support based on student need. Within MTSS, Tier 1 focuses on universal school-wide practices that emphasize prevention and early identification. A key component of this level is universal screening, which involves systematically assessing all students using standardized tools at key developmental stages rather than relying on reactive referral-based identification. This proactive approach improves identification accuracy, reduces reliance on subjective judgment, and helps ensure more equitable identification across groups. Empirical evidence suggests that universal screening systems can meaningfully change identification patterns and outcomes. Studies of MTSS implementation find that schools using universal screening identify students earlier and reduce racial disparities in referral rates compared to traditional methods. Early identification allows for intervention during critical developmental periods when learning gaps are more responsive to support. For example, early literacy interventions have been shown to reduce the likelihood of later special education placement and grade retention. However, these effects are typically moderate and depend on implementation quality, suggesting that screening is most effective when paired with adequate instructional resources. To understand the fiscal implications of these reforms more clearly, it is important to distinguish between per student cost and system-wide expenditures. Universal screening itself is relatively inexpensive, typically costing only a few dollars per student annually when administered at scale in elementary schools. The more substantial costs arise from the additional special education and intervention services provided after identification, which vary depending on intensity and duration of support. However, estimating total fiscal impact requires assumptions about how many students would newly qualify for services under more comprehensive screening systems. Current research suggests that a non-trivial portion of those students, particularly those in early grades or from under-resourced districts, experience learning disabilities that are never formally evaluated or formally identified under existing referral-based systems. For this reason, the argument for universal screening should not depend on precise predictions of total cost increases or savings. Instead, the central claim is that these reforms improve the timing and accuracy of identification and that any associated increase in spending reflects more appropriate alignment of resources with student need rather than inefficiency. The feasibility of these reforms can be further understood through Peter Singer's distinction between strong and weak moral obligations. Singer argues that if individuals have the capacity to prevent harm without sacrificing something of comparable moral importance, they are morally required to do so. Applied to educational policy, a strong interpretation would require fully funding and restructuring IDEA while implementing universal screening nationwide. However, given political and institutional constraints, a weaker but still morally significant obligation requires taking meaningful steps towards reducing harms. The weaker obligation can be met through incremental but impactful strategies, including state-level mandates, pilot programs in high-need districts, and reallocation of existing resources towards early intervention and screening. These approaches allow policymakers to begin addressing under-identification within current constraints while building the infrastructure necessary for broader reform. One common objection is that these reforms are too costly, particularly given the additional services that may be required following increased identification. It is important to clarify what exactly is being funded. Estimates suggest that early intervention services cost approximately $8,000 to $10,000 per child annually, compared to $12,000 to $15,000 for more intensive later stage services. However, this does not necessarily mean that early intervention reduces total lifetime costs, as students identified later may receive services for a shorter period. Therefore, the case of these reforms should not be solely on cost savings. Instead, earlier intervention represents a more efficient and educationally effective allocation of resources, even if total spending remains similar or increases. Economic analyses associated with James Heckman estimate long-term returns on early childhood investments ranging from $7 to $10 spent. However, these investments estimates incorporate broad downstream effects that may reflect optimistic assumptions. A more cautious interpretation of that early intervention is likely to produce meaningful social benefits, even if precise fiscal returns are uncertain. Additionally, the distribution of costs and benefits presents a political challenge. Current taxpayers bear the upfront costs of expanded services, while many of the long-term benefits accrue to future taxpayers. This mismatch helps explain resistance to such investments, even when they are socially beneficial. A further objection is that increasing school-based services may have limited impact given the broader role of social detriments, such as poverty and access to healthcare, in shaping educational outcomes. This critique highlights real limitations of educational policy. However, it does not undermine the importance of school-based identification and intervention. Rather, those reforms should be understood as necessary but not sufficient components of a broader effect to reduce inequality. Even modest improvements in early academic outcomes can accumulate over time and prevent students from falling further behind. From the perspective of Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach, these reforms are morally justified because they expand individuals' real opportunities to develop essential human capabilities, including thought, reasoning, and participation in society. Without proper identification and support, students are effectively denied these opportunities. Concerns about stigma and over-identification, while valid, are outweighed by the harms of under-identification. Universal screening may also reduce stigma by normalizing evaluation processes and distributing support more equitably. Under-identification of learning disabilities reflects both resource limitations and structural flaws in education systems. Addressing this issue requires not only increased funding, but also systemic changes to how students are identified and supported. By combining targeted funding reform with universal early screening, policymakers can create a more accurate, equitable, and effective system of identification. Even where full implementation is not immediately feasible, incremental steps towards these reforms remain both practically necessary and morally required.